Hey guys, tonight we drift into a place where the night air smells faintly of moss and cold water, and the fog curls low over a sleepy French valley. Somewhere out there, beneath the silver sheen of moonlight, the Volon River winds its way, through fields and forests, as if nothing could possibly disturb it. But you know better. In 1984, this stretch of water became a stage for one of France's most haunting mysteries. A story so tangled that even 4 decades later, people still argue in cafes about who is guilty, who is innocent, and whether anyone will ever know the truth. You're going to stand there on the bank, listening to the dark water slide past and feel that whisper in your bones. And just so you know, you probably won't survive this without a few GOOSEBUMPS. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a narrow country lane, shoes crunching on gravel, the kind of path that feels like it leads into another century. The surrounding hills are wrapped in a cold, damp mist that presses in like a curious stranger. You pass a sagging wooden fence, a farmhouse with a single amber light glowing inside, and the muted cluck of a restless chicken. Somewhere close, the Volon River mutters to itself, the sound muffled but constant. Historians still argue whether the Volon is truly as peaceful as it looks, or whether the quietness is just an elaborate mask. The river has seen centuries of fishing, childhood games, and lovers sneaking away from watchful parents. It has also seen drownings, some accidental, some whispered about in low tones at the market. One quirky tidbit you pick up from a local: in the 1800s, people here believed the river could choose who would survive a fall into its waters. They swore that if it liked you, it would spit you out gently downstream. If not, well, you were part of the silt now. The October air is biting, your breath drifting like small, pale ghosts. You glance up at the mountains ringing the valley. They loom like sleeping giants, their heads wrapped in cloud. Somewhere down the slope, you spot the line of the Volon, wide enough to reflect the moon in shivering silver. And you remember why you came here. This is where a child's body was found, tied and weighted, as though someone wanted to keep the truth down there in the mud forever. Your steps slow as you approach the bank. The grass here is slick with dew, and you catch a faint scent of wood smoke from a chimney upstream. The locals say, on certain nights like this, you can hear a child's laughter carried over the water. Most brush it off as the wind, but the older ones will give you a look, the kind that says, "Don't ask questions you don't want answered." The river itself is narrower than you expected, though still deep enough to hide its secrets. A frog plops into the water, the ripples fading into the current. You think about how, back in 1984, this scene would have been chaos. Gendarmes in dark uniforms, photographers snapping flashbulbs, reporters jostling for the best angle, and neighbors clustering just far enough away to pretend they weren't watching. The thing is, you can almost feel the weight of those stares even now. Small towns have long memories, and this valley is no exception. Everyone here knows everyone else, which means suspicion doesn't have far to travel. One historical fact that sticks with you: in rural France during the 1980s, police work often relied less on forensics and more on community gossip. And in a case like this, gossip was gasoline on the fire. You crouch near the water, running your fingers through the cold air above it. The surface is dark, glossy, and unreadable, just like the hearts of some of the people who walked these banks 40 years ago. A gust of wind slides along the river, rattling the reeds, and you get the uncanny sensation of being watched. Somewhere to your left, An owl hoots a long, low note that feels like a question. You wonder if it's the same kind of question the Volin has been asking since that autumn evening. Who could take a child's life like that? Why here, of all places? And why has the answer stayed hidden for so long? A dog barks from a farmhouse in the distance. You straighten up, brushing your palms on your jeans, and start walking again. Your path hugs the river, the fog swirling around your ankles. Every so often, you see the ghost of your reflection in the water, fractured and fleeting. It's easy to imagine how, on a darker night, you might not notice the difference between your own shadow and something or someone else moving beneath the surface. You pass a sagging bridge, its wooden planks slick and darkened by years of damp. The locals say it's older than most of the houses here, and if you stand in the middle, you can hear the river singing underneath, though, to your ears. It sounds more like a low, steady hum. You pause, leaning on the railing, watching the current pull away into the darkness. And you think, somewhere out there, in the cold archives of time, the answer to what happened on these banks is waiting. The only question is whether anyone will ever be brave or foolish enough to pull it up. You follow the river's curve until the village comes into view, a scatter of stone houses with slate roofs glistening from the evening mist. A church spire punctuates the skyline, its bell silent at this hour. Somewhere among these homes, 40 years ago, a small boy named Gregory Villemin lived out the brief chapters of his life. You picture him as the neighbors described: dark hair, big eyes that sparkled with mischief, the kind of child who would toddle confidently into a room full of adults and somehow make everyone smile. He was 4 years old in the autumn of 1984, and in a place like Lepanji-sur-Vallon, that meant he was well known to almost everyone. You imagine him walking the short path from home to the bakery with his mother, clutching a croissant still warm from the oven, or trailing behind his father, eager to imitate the way he tied knots in fishing line. Historians still argue whether Gregory's life was as idyllic as the early photos make it seem, or whether there were undercurrents in the village that even a child could sense. In many rural communities of the time, families lived close together for generations, which meant old feuds never quite faded. The Villemins were no exception. They had their allies and their rivals, and sometimes those lines blurred in dangerous ways. One quirky local memory you overhear in the cafe. Gregory apparently loved the color red so much that he insisted on wearing a bright knitted cap even in summer, and he'd throw a theatrical tantrum if anyone tried to take it off. It's the kind of detail that lodges in your mind, a thread of joy woven through the darker fabric of what's to come. You reach the street where the Villemins lived back then. The houses here are simple, their walls weathered by decades of wind and rain. A faint scent of wood smoke hangs in the air, mingling with the smell of damp leaves. You stop outside one particular house, not the same color as it was in 1984, but you know it's the right one. You imagine the small kitchen, where Christine Villemin would have stood making tea, her eyes occasionally flicking to the clock. That clock would matter more than anyone realized, because the hours of that day would later be dissected down to the minute by police, lawyers, and journalists dot in the telling. Gregory's last day starts simply enough. His mother said she dressed him in his favorite clothes, kissed his cheek, and told him to play outside while she tended to chores. It's the kind of moment parents have lived a million times, never suspecting the universe is quietly holding its breath. A neighbor might have waved as they passed, maybe even spoken to him, though years later, some would remember that detail differently, or not at all. And here's where the chill creeps in. While Christine was still inside, the phone rang. A voice on the other end, harsh, distorted, spat out a few words that would become infamous. They had her son. The call was brief, abrupt, and when she looked outside moments later, the yard was empty. You walk slowly along the narrow lane, the stones beneath your shoes slick with moss. You can almost hear that ring echoing through the quiet house, the pause before the receiver is lifted, the intake of breath as the voice delivers its message. Police accounts say that shortly after the call, the Villemans received another communication, this one handwritten. An anonymous letter, dripping with malice, claimed responsibility for the abduction and hinted at long-standing grudges against the family. The author signed with a mocking flourish, as if taunting them to guess the truth. The timeline that followed was frantic. Phone calls to relatives, frantic searches along the riverbank, neighbors fanning out through fields and woods. And then, as the sun slipped lower, the Volun gave up its secret. A fisherman spotted something caught among reeds downstream, a small figure in waterlogged clothes, bound in a way that suggested whoever had done this wanted the river to hide him forever. You pause at the edge of the bridge, looking down into the water. Even now, the current is deceptively gentle. It's easy to imagine how a body could drift unnoticed until the right angle of light or the wrong set of eyes revealed it. In the days that followed, the name Gregory was on every lip in the village, and soon in every newspaper across France. But the story wasn't just about a murdered child. It was about the strange, poisonous network of grudges, envy, and family disputes that seemed to thread through every corner of this place. The part that still twists in your mind is how quickly the narrative turned not just toward finding a killer, but toward unraveling decades of petty rivalries. You pass an old man leaning against a wall, puffing slowly on a pipe. His eyes follow you for a moment, then shift back to the cobblestones. You wonder if he was here in '84, if he heard the news before the radio did, if he's been carrying his own version of the story ever since. The street narrows, the houses crowding closer. You can feel the weight of history here, not the grand kind of history with parades and monuments, but the intimate, almost claustrophobic history of lives lived under each other's gaze. The kind of history that can turn warm familiarity into quiet menace. Somewhere nearby, a dog lets out a half-hearted bark, then falls silent again. The air smells faintly of bread from the boulangerie, and for a heartbeat, you can almost imagine Gregory skipping along beside you, red cap bobbing, eager to get home before his mother calls him in for supper. And then the image fades, leaving only the dim streetlight, the damp stone, and the steady whisper of the Volun in the distance. You keep moving through the village, tracing the same streets that once carried not only footsteps, but secrets sealed in envelopes. The air feels heavier here, as if the walls themselves remember the whispers. This is where the poison pen letters came from, or at least where many believe they were born. You picture them, cheap stationery, blocky handwriting, phrases so spiteful they practically hiss off the page. The letters had started long before Gregory's death, sent to members of the Valleman family over several years. They were full of accusations, threats, and insults, little bombs dropped into the family's daily life. And whoever wrote them seemed to know far too much about their routines, their arguments, even their private moments. Historians still argue whether these were the work of a single obsessive mind or the shared pastime of more than one conspirator. One quirky, almost absurd detail you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. The writer often underlined words for emphasis, but instead of a straight line, they used a kind of wobbly zigzag, like someone doodling lightning bolts. Some handwriting analysts swore this could be a clue to the person's identity. Others rolled their eyes, suggesting it was just a nervous habit. You pass by the old post office, now shuttered. The wooden door is scuffed, the brass handle worn smooth by decades of hands. In the 1980s, this place would have been a crossroads, for the town letters, parcels, and gossip all funneling through here. Imagine the anonymous author stepping inside, maybe blending into a small queue, sliding an envelope toward the counter with the same ease as buying a stamp for a birthday card. The police had a nickname for the sender: Le Corbeau, the Crow. It wasn't original. France has used that name for anonymous letter writers in other scandals, but it stuck. The Crow's letters were written in French, laced with local idioms, suggesting they came from someone who knew the region well. And each one dripped with venom toward the Villemins, painting them as arrogant, greedy, undeserving of their modest success. You duck into a narrow side street, the kind where the houses lean in toward each other, their upper floors almost touching above your head. The cobblestones here are slick from a thin drizzle, and the faint echo of your steps sounds like someone following a pace behind. The feeling matches the effect those letters had on the family. No matter where they went, the Crow seemed to be. Just over their shoulder, the handwriting was analyzed, photocopied, and pinned on boards in police offices. They compared it to dozens of villagers, sometimes asking people to write out set phrases to catch them off guard. The trouble was, in a small place like this, suspicion was easy to spread, but hard to prove. The letters didn't just insult, they predicted. In the weeks before Gregory's death, one note reportedly warned that tragedy would strike, that the Villemins would suffer in a way they couldn't imagine. Christine and Jean-Marie, his parents, must have read those words with a chill running down their spines. But how do you react to a threat that comes without a name, without a clear path to stop it? You stop beneath a flickering street lamp, listening to the patter of rain on the rooftops. Somewhere a radio plays faintly an old chanson, soft and lilting. The tune is so at odds with the tension in your head that it almost makes you laugh. In that bitter, ironic way mysteries sometimes do. It's the same way people talk about how these letters were sometimes dropped into mailboxes alongside holiday cards and newsletters. As if the Crow wanted to hide their poison among everyday sweetness. Historians still argue whether the letters were truly the central thread in the case, or just one part of a much larger web. But for the police at the time, they were gold, tangible, evidence, something to hold in a case that otherwise felt like chasing fog dot. You imagine holding one in your own hands. The paper is thin, the ink slightly smudged at the edges. The smell is faintly chemical, maybe from the pen, or maybe from wherever the envelope was stored before it was sent. You turn it over, looking at the address neat, deliberate, and then the stamp in the corner, the glue faintly yellowed with age. There's a strange intimacy to it, knowing the writer's hands were here, pressing the paper flat, sealing it shut, deciding exactly how to hurt the person on the other end. One theory you overhear at the cafe comes from an elderly man with a fondness for strong coffee and stronger opinions. It was more than one person. You can tell by the way the tone changes, sometimes mocking, sometimes furious, sometimes almost cold. He taps the table with a bony finger, as if that seals the argument. Across from him, a younger woman shakes her head, saying it was just one clever manipulator. Someone who knew how to play different roles to keep suspicion moving in circles. The letters didn't stop with the murder. They continued, gloating, insisting the writer had outsmarted everyone. Each new one brought fresh waves of outrage, fear, and gossip. And in a town this size, gossip is like wildfire. It can start from the tiniest spark and soon scorch everything it touches. You pass the last cluster of houses before the road dips back toward the river. The rain has stopped, but the air is still damp, clinging to your clothes. You think about that unseen hand, pen scratching across paper in some dimly lit kitchen, the steady rhythm of someone shaping sentences designed to wound, and you wonder if they ever smiled to themselves before folding the page, knowing the chaos they were about to unleash. You drift back toward the heart of the village, the cobblestones carrying you through a maze of lanes where every window feels like an eye. It's here, in these narrow streets, that the sense of a community under suspicion truly seeps. Into your skin? In a place like Lepanzy-sur-Valin, you can't buy a loaf of bread without seeing someone you've known your whole life, or at least someone who knows someone who knows you. That closeness can be comforting. Until it T. In the weeks after Gregory's death, the entire valley seemed to turn in on itself. Neighbors eyed each other in the post office queue. Conversations stopped when certain people walked into the cafe, and polite nods in the street were edged with something colder. Historians still argue whether the police encouraged this climate of suspicion to flush out the killer, or whether it was simply the natural reaction of a community in shock. One quirky tidbit that still circulates in the local folklore: some villagers swore they could tell who was guilty by the way they stirred their coffee. If the spoon clinked too loudly against the cup, nervous. Stirred counterclockwise, definitely hiding something. It's absurd, but in a tense atmosphere, even the smallest gestures became magnified into clues. You wander past the town square, where the weekly market sets up every Saturday morning. Today it's empty, except for a few stray leaves skittering across the flagstones. But back then, this would have been a hotbed of whispers. A stall holder selling cheese might lean into, pass along a rumor from a reliable source, only for the next customer to hear a completely different version of the same story. The air itself seemed thick with half-truths. The Villemin family, once respected and even admired for their steady rise in local society, found themselves under an invisible siege. Some relatives were openly sympathetic. Others were quietly resentful. And the murder exposed old fractures that had been papered over for years. Police interviews pulled at these threads, asking pointed questions that made people defensive or evasive. Friendships cooled. Cousins stopped visiting. Invitations dried. Up, you pause outside a modest house with lace curtains in the windows. You've been told that in the days after the murder, a woman here refused to answer her door, convinced the gendarmes would arrive any minute to question her. When they finally did, she claimed she knew nothing, had seen nothing, but her eyes flickered toward the floor as she spoke. Was it guilt, or simply the fear of being drawn into something she couldn't control? The way suspicion spread here reminds you of the way fog creeps along the river slough, silent and impossible to contain once it's set in. Even those with rock-solid alibis weren't immune. If you have nothing to hide, why are you so defensive? Became the unspoken refrain. And if someone smiled too easily or laughed too loudly, well, that was suspicious too. The police took advantage of this small-town dynamic, holding group interviews, asking people to repeat stories in front of others, looking for contradictions. Sometimes they'd accidentally let slip a detail from the investigation, just to see you picked it up and ran with it. It's a classic tactic in law enforcement. Create an information ripple and watch how it distorts as it moves through the community. You step into the doorway of the bakery for shelter as a sudden breeze sweeps through the square. The smell of fresh bread wafts out, warm and yeasty. The baker nods at you, flour dusting his forearms, and for a moment it's easy to forget the shadows hanging over this village. Then you remember a fact someone mentioned. Back in '84, this very shop was one of the unofficial hubs of information. People came for croissants and left with the latest speculation about who had written the letters, or who might have been seen near the river that day. One old man, sitting on a bench outside, leans toward you conspiratorially. Everyone knew. He says, his voice low but steady, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. Whether it was a name, a suspicion, or just the admission that the killer might be among them, you can't tell. His eyes drift to the far end of the street, where the hills rise and the mist gathers. Historians still argue whether small communities in crisis naturally look inward for a culprit, or whether the pressure of outside attention journalists, police, and national spotlight forces them too. Here, it felt like both. The villagers were caught between closing ranks to protect their own and quietly dissecting each other. Slives for signs of guilt. You leave the bakery doorway and make your way toward the river again, the path narrowing between two high stone walls. A cat slips past your legs, tail flicking like a metronome. Somewhere above, a window creaks open, and you feel the gaze of someone unseen. This is what it must have been like then. Everyone watching, everyone watched. It's a strange kind of paranoia, the kind that turns the simplest interactions into moments of theater. Buying vegetables at the market becomes an interrogation. Passing someone on the bridge turns into a silent exchange of accusations. You think about how exhausting it must have been, living with that constant undercurrent of mistrust. And yet, for some, perhaps it was energizing, an opportunity to settle old scores under the cover of righteous outrage. The stone walls end, and you step out onto the open bank of the Volun again. The water glimmers faintly under the overcast sky, carrying with it the reflections of houses, hills, and the tangled suspicions of a community that, in some ways, has never truly returned to the way it was before. The air along the Volun feels sharper tonight, as if the river itself is bracing for what you're about to recall. You follow the current downstream, toward the spot where the investigation began to twist and double back on itself. In the early days, the police moved quickly, perhaps too quickly, trying to untangle the threads of a story that seemed to change every time they touched it. The first theory was simple, almost comforting in its clarity. Find the writer of the poison pen letters, and you'd find the killer. But that thread soon tangled. Handwriting experts disagreed. The alleged timelines didn't always line up, and witnesses contradicted each other. Historians still argue whether this confusion was the result of human error, or whether someone deliberately planted false leads. One quirky but telling moment in the case. A local man swore he had seen a stranger loitering near the river that day, wearing what he described as a hat too big for his head. This detail became a minor obsession for amateur sleuths, who debated whether it was a disguise, a coincidence, or the kind of faulty memory that slips into every high-profile investigation. You step onto the wooden bridge, its planks slick underfoot. This was a vantage point for many of the searchers that evening, eyes scanning the water for any sign of the missing boy. The gendarmes had cordoned off sections of the bank, but the river is a restless thing. It doesn't wait for permission to carry its secrets away. The investigation team faced pressure from every direction. The family wanted answers. The press wanted headlines, and the public wanted anyone to blame. In that atmosphere, it was easy to jump on the first promising lead, even if it later dissolved under scrutiny. And dissolve they did. One suspect was pulled into the spotlight. Almost immediately, a man whose strained relationship with the Villemans had been no secret. He was questioned, released, questioned again. Each time, the details shifted. One day he claimed to have been at work during the crucial hours. The next, he admitted he'd left early for reasons he couldn't quite explain. You walk past the remnants of an old police barricade, just a couple of bent posts and a frayed rope now. It's easy to imagine the scene in 1984, floodlights glaring against the mist, uniformed officers pacing, reporters shouting questions from behind the cordon. The tension would have been thick enough to taste. Historians still argue whether the police allowed themselves to be swayed by personal feelings toward certain suspects. In small communities, those feelings are impossible to fully set aside. A nod here, a frown there, tiny signals that can tip the balance of an interrogation. The most dramatic twist in those early days came when one suspect, a relative, was arrested, charged, and then released after new evidence emerged. The back and forth fed the press like a bonfire. Headlines screamed betrayal, vengeance, family feuds. Meanwhile, the real killer or killers remained unseen. You turn down a side path toward a cluster of houses, the kind that look like they've been standing for centuries. One, in particular, still carries a faint outline or a police notice. Once hung on the door, neighbors remember the search vividly. Officers combing through cupboards, opening drawers, lifting floorboards. They left with boxes of papers and small objects, though no one knew or would say what they had found. There's something almost theatrical about the way the early investigation unfolded. Evidence would appear and vanish. Witnesses would suddenly recall or forget key moments. One day a lead would be hailed as the breakthrough. The next, it would crumble. It's the investigative equivalent of chasing shadows, and every shadow here seemed to have its own agenda. One elderly resident told you about a meeting in the town hall during that first week. The gendarmes addressed the villagers, urging them to come forward with anything suspicious they had seen or heard, but the mood was far from cooperative. People whispered in the back, exchanged glances, and avoided speaking up in front of others. It wasn't fear of the killer, she said quietly. It was fear of turning against a neighbor and being wrong. The river comes back into view, wider here, the banks more open. You pause, leaning on the railing of a small footbridge, and watch the current slide past. You can't help but think about how quickly the investigation's initial momentum was swallowed by conflicting stories, misplaced evidence, and a growing sense that the truth was slipping further away. Somewhere, upstream, the mist thickens, curling into shapes that almost look like figures moving in the dark. You know it's just the night playing tricks on you. But then again, so much of this case was built on tricks, misdirection, manipulation, and the quiet, stubborn refusal of the truth to rise to the surface. And just as you're about to turn away, you remember that the next twist was coming, a shift in the investigation that would not only divide the village, but fracture the family at its heart. You step off the footbridge, the wooden planks groaning under your weight, and head toward the dim cluster of lights where the old courthouse once stood. In your mind, the night blurs into the swirl of flashbulbs and urgent voices. The investigation into little Gregory's death was no longer just a police matter. It was morphing into a public trial before the courtroom doors had even opened. When the first charges were filed, the village split down invisible lines. You could almost map the allegiances by who stood where in the square. One side near the bakery, arms folded, heads nodding grimly. The other gathered outside the post office, voices low but heated. Historians still argue whether this division was fueled more by actual evidence or by personal grievances that had been simmering for years. The first trial was a spectacle. Lawyers traded barbed remarks, journalists scribbled furiously, and the accused, often a family member, sat under the unblinking gaze of both the public and the press. The prosecution laid out a narrative that seemed to connect the poison pen letters, the family feud, and the tragic drowning. It was tidy. Too tidy, some thought. One quirky detail from that period: during a break in proceedings, a court clerk accidentally left the microphone on, broadcasting the sound of his lunch, a crunchy baguette and what sounded like an enthusiastic gulp of wine over the loudspeakers. The tension broke for a moment, laughter rippling through the room, before the judge's glare restored the gravity of the situation. But beneath the theatrics, the cracks in the case began to widen. Witness testimony conflicted. Forensic evidence didn't always align. And in the background, a persistent whisper: what if the real culprit had never been in this room at all? The retrials only deepened the confusion. Charges were dropped, then reinstated, then dropped again. Legal arguments hinged on minute details: a phone call's timestamp, the exact wording of a letter, whether someone's alibi held up to the minute. Each twist pulled the narrative further from the simple tragedy it had begun as. You wander past the shuttered windows of the old building, the stone facade cold to the touch. Somewhere inside, those heavy courtroom benches still sit. their wood worn smooth by decades of shifting bodies. You imagine the jurors of that time, faces drawn, wrestling with conflicting testimonies, and the knowledge that whatever decision they made would leave part of the village convinced they were wrong. Media coverage didn't help. The French press, already famous for its flair, turned the case into a national obsession. Tabloids ran lurid headlines. Television shows recreated scenes with actors in period clothing. The story of a small boy from a small village became a stage for a nation's anxieties about justice, family loyalty, and the creeping intrusion of modernity into rural life. Historians still argue whether the media's involvement brought necessary scrutiny or hopelessly contaminated the case. It's hard to say. On one hand, national attention kept the investigation from going cold too quickly. On the other, it invited wild theories, public shaming, and a kind of performative outrage that didn't necessarily serve the truth. You pass a side street, narrow and uneven, that locals still call Whisper Lane, because it's where journalists would linger, hoping to catch townsfolk willing to speak off the record. Most gave them nothing, just polite refusals or a silent shake of the head. But occasionally, someone would mutter a name, a suspicion, a half-memory. Those fragments, printed without context, became part of the ever-expanding web of rumor that the retrials dragged on for years, each one promising resolution and delivering instead another layer of complexity. Judges came and went, prosecutors shifted. Strategies and defense lawyers grew visibly older in the process. Some of the accused spent more time fighting charges than living the rest of their lives. One man, who had been a suspect in the early days and later cleared, famously said, "They gave me back my freedom, but not my life." It's the kind of line that sticks with you, not just for its sadness, but for the truth in it. You stand now where the courthouse steps meet the square. In the daytime, this place is bright and ordinary kids kicking footballs, people sipping coffee at outdoor tables. But tonight, under the dim glow of the lamps, it's easy to see the shadows of those long-ago reporters, the tense relatives, the police officers avoiding eye contact with the crowd. And somewhere beyond this square, the river keeps flowing, patient and silent, as if it knows the truth and simply refuses to share it. You can feel the weight of what's still unsolved pressing in, but you also know that the case's long reach will soon stretch beyond this village into the wider currents of French society, and eventually far away from the Volin entirely. You drift away from the square, following the scent of wood smoke curling out of unseen chimneys, and the cobblestones give way to a smoother road lined with shuttered houses. Out here, away from the courthouse and the river, you can feel the space to breathe, but not to forget. The case of little Gregory had long since left the Volin Valley, seeping into living rooms across France and leaving a thin film of mistrust in its wake. It wasn't just a village matter anymore. National headlines turned the case into a mirror. For broader anxieties about whether the French justice system could truly protect the innocent, whether small-town bonds were strong enough to withstand scandal, and whether the media was a watchdog or a vulture, politicians dropped carefully worded remarks about lessons to be learned, as if the death of a child were a case study rather than a wound. Historians still argue whether the case marked the beginning of a new era of trial by media in France. In earlier decades, the press often maintained a thin veneer of restraint. Now, television crews roamed the countryside like hunters, microphones ready, lights hot and unflattering. Every fresh development, real or rumored, flared briefly on the national stage before fading into the background noise of the next scandal. You pass an old newsstand, its paint peeling, and imagine the 1980s covers shouting in bold type, "New Suspect in the Volin Mystery," or "Letters Returned to Haunt Family." Those who were there remember buying the papers not because they expected answers, but because they wanted to be part of the conversation. The case had become a kind of cultural currency. You either knew the latest theory, or you were out of the loop. One quirky tidbit: at the height of the frenzy, a bakery in a nearby town began selling mystery baguettes, each wrapped in a paper slip containing a printed clue from the case. The clues were, of course, publicly known facts, but customers treated them like collectible cards, swapping for the ones they didn't have. For the families at the center, this national fascination was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept pressure on the authorities to keep digging. On the other, it ensured they could never slip quietly back into anonymity. Wherever they went, whether to the market, the cinema, or even on holiday, someone would recognize them, remember the headlines, and stare just a little too long. You keep walking, your footsteps echoing faintly off the walls, and you think about how the case's shadows stretched into unexpected corners. Law schools began using it as an example in lectures about media influence on legal proceedings. Documentarians found themselves drawn to its mix of tragedy and uncertainty. Even in pop culture, the name Gregory became shorthand for an unsolved puzzle. But beyond the noise, there was the quiet erosion of trust in rural policing. People began to wonder if local gendarmes could truly be impartial in cases where they knew half the suspects personally. Historians still argue whether this erosion was justified, or whether it simply reflected a growing national cynicism about authority in general. You pause outside a cafe with its chairs stacked upside down on the tables, the smell of strong coffee lingering in the air. Somewhere inside, maybe, is a patron who remembers the day the first letter was read aloud on national television, or the shock when an arrest was made, only to be undone months later. The collective memory here is a patchwork half-facts, overheard conversations, the grainy image of a boy's face on the evening news. The 1990s brought a slower pace to the public's obsession, but the case never truly died down. Every few years, a new article would surface, rehashing the events, sometimes hinting at fresh leads. Some villagers dreaded these revivals. Others leaned into them, giving interviews to journalists who arrived in sensible shoes and weatherproof jackets, ready to rediscover the truth. One of the strangest side effects of the lingering interest was a small tourism bump. True crime enthusiasts, long before it became a trendy podcast genre, would visit the region, wandering the riverbanks, photographing the bridges, quietly standing in front of the victim's former home, as if hoping the air itself might give. Up a clue, you turn onto a road that edges back toward the Volun, the moonlight tracing a silver path across the rippling surface. The water seems unchanged, but you know it's carried 3 decades worth of unanswered questions downstream. And though the immediate heat of the investigation had cooled, the embers never went out. In France, some people say that's certain. Stories haunt the Republic. They never resolve cleanly, they never fade entirely, and they resurface whenever the country is in the mood to reflect on its own flaws. The case of Gregory was one of those stories. By the early 2000s, it had become less a whodunit and more a parable about the costs of suspicion, the fragility of small communities, and the stubborn elusiveness of truth. You take one last look at the river, the water whispering against its banks, and you can almost feel it pulling you toward the next chapter far from here, across oceans, to another place where a different kind of quiet masked a mystery just as stubborn. You blink, and the mist along the Volun gives way to a sun-bleached horizon. The air feels different, now warmer, salted faintly from a distant bay, and the smell of wood smoke is replaced by eucalyptus and hot asphalt. You've landed half a world away in Australia, where the sky is so wide it almost dares you to feel small. The suburb of Ellawong lies quietly in the Sutherland Shire of New South Wales, nestled between the Georges and Woronora rivers. It's the kind of place where cul-de-sacs twist gently toward the water, and houses perch on sloping lawns dotted with jacaranda trees that come spring rain purple petals over driveways. If the Volligan's charm was moss and shadow, Illawong's is light and open air. From your vantage point, you see neat brick homes with tiled roofs and the occasional boat trailer parked beside them, a nod to weekend fishing trips. There's a stillness to the streets that's both comforting and a little eerie, like a movie set waiting for its extras to arrive. Here, in 1993, a young woman named Bronwyn Winfield lived with her family. Her disappearance would ripple through the area, just as the Volin case had done in France, though in a softer, suburban register.mainstream fact. Illawong in the early 1990s was undergoing a bit of a housing boom, as more families moved south from Sydney's busier center, seeking quieter lifestyles. Many of the homes here were new or freshly renovated, their gardens a mix of native plants and imported roses. People knew their neighbors at least by sight, and crime was so rare it made the local paper for weeks if a bicycle was stolen. Historians still argue whether Bronwyn's case drew so much attention because of its intrinsic mystery or because it disrupted the region's self-image as a safe, unremarkable suburb. After all, mysteries belong in fiction or on the evening news from somewhere else, not in your own postcode. You turn a corner and hear the distant whine of a lawnmower. Somewhere a dog barks twice, then decides it's not worth the trouble. You can almost imagine Bronwyn, a young mother, strolling down this very street, pushing a prom, waving at a neighbor who's hosing down the driveway. It's a sunny, ordinary scene, the sort that doesn't hint at the shadows waiting in the months ahead. One quirky tidbit. In the early 90s, Illawong had a tiny video rental shop that doubled as the unofficial community hub. People would pop in to rent the latest action flick and end up swapping local gossip between the aisles of VHS tapes. It's easy to picture Bronwyn here, maybe renting a family movie, nodding politely as someone commented on the weather. When you reach the water's edge, the Georges River stretches before you, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple from a passing speedboat. This river isn't like the Volino thick forests here, just sun-drenched banks and mangroves, dipping their roots into the tide. But like any waterway, it can hold secrets. You find yourself wondering if this is part of what makes moving. Between these two stories so unsettling, the realization that tragedy doesn't require Gothic castles or lonely mountains. It can bloom just as easily under cloudless skies, and in streets where the bins are always brought in on time. As you walk, you pass the small local shops, chemist, bakery, corner store, where everyone knows each other's routines. Back in 1993, these shopkeepers probably knew Bronwyn by name, maybe even her children's names. And yet, knowing someone doesn't mean knowing the truth of their life. Illawong's pace of life was slow, but its geography made it just close enough to Sydney for the city's media to swoop in when a story broke. Bronwyn's disappearance, once reported, quickly drew camera crews who parked their vans along the sleepy streets, beaming the suburb's image into homes across Australia. You pause outside a modest brick house, not hers, but one that could have been. A pair of gum leaves flutter down from a tree overhead, casting brief shadows on the front steps. This, you realize, is the unsettling thing. In the middle of such ordinary stillness, a person can simply vanish. Some locals and later interviews recalled that the police presence seemed almost surreal, detectives in dark suits walking, the same footpaths children used to ride bikes. Others remembered the strangeness of seeing their own neighborhood on the evening news. The familiar reframed as suspicious. Here, under this blazing Australian sun, the air doesn't carry the chill of the Volin, but the unease is just as sharp. You take another step down the quiet street, knowing you're moving closer to the heart of Bronwyn's story, where the warmth of a family home will soon be shadowed by unanswered questions. You drift further into Illawong's heart. And there she is, Bronwyn Winfield, though in your mind's eye she isn't yet the subject of whispered questions. Instead, you see her as she might have been in the late 1980s, a woman in her 20s. Hair catching the sun, a ready laugh when her friends teased her about her habit of leaving coffee cups, half finished on every available surface. Bronwyn's beginnings weren't the stuff of tabloid headlines. She grew up in suburban Australia, attended local schools, had a wide circle of acquaintances, and at least on the surface, fit neatly into the easy rhythm of Illawong life. By the early 90s, she was a mother of 2 young children, the kind of parent who remembered to pack lunchboxes with a little extra treat on Fridays. Her days likely included the same predictable loops as any young mom's: daycare drop-offs, supermarket runs, laundry that seemed to multiply overnight. Mainstream historical fact: the early 90s were a period of transition for many Australian families, with interest rates having peaked at an eye-watering 17% just a few years earlier in 1989. By 93, the economy was improving, but the hangover of financial strain still lingered for a lot of households. For a young family like Bronwyn's, keeping up with mortgage payments and daily expenses might have been a background hum, never loud enough to be the main story, but always there dotting your slow walk through her world. You can hear the distant chatter of her children, maybe playing on the grass out back. You picture her hanging laundry while listening to a portable radio, a pop song fading in and out as the wind shifts. Quirky tidbit: Bronwyn reportedly had a knack for remembering birthdays, not just of close friends, but of neighbors, co-workers, even the local postie. She'd send a card or drop off a slice of homemade cake. In a small community, gestures like that stick in people's minds. Later, when she vanished, those same people would recall her kindness with a sharp pang, as if her absence had punched a hole in the social fabric. Historians still argue whether Bronwyn's life before her disappearance contained hints of unrest, subtle changes in behavior, strained conversations, moments of withdrawal, or whether hindsight simply stitches shadows where none existed. Some neighbors would later say they thought she seemed tired in those final weeks. Others insisted she was her usual bright self. You step into an imagined scene. Bronwyn's kitchen, circa 1993. The benchtop carries the morning's debris school. Permission slips, a jar of Vegemite, a half-peeled banana. Through the open window, you hear the hum of cicadas. A faint breeze stirs the curtains. You could almost believe nothing bad could ever happen in a house like this. And yet, this is the delicate tension in her story. It's a life that feels deeply familiar, one you might step into without noticing, but one that's about to collide with the unthinkable. She was, by all accounts, socially active, the kind of person who'd join in community events without fuss. If there was a fundraiser at the school, Bronwyn would have been there, helping set up trestle tables or arranging raffle prizes. This visibility in the neighborhood made her eventual disappearance all the more shocking. People who vanish are often imagined as isolated, cut off from their communities, but Bronwyn was right there, in the middle of hers. Her family life appeared, to outside eyes, stable enough. She had her role, her routines, her children's milestones to celebrate. But as anyone who's ever lived behind closed doors knows, appearances can be more like wallpaper, lovely from a distance, fragile up close. You picture her in those final days before the vanishing, running errands, maybe stopping at that little Illawong video shop, chatting with someone she knew from the school run. Ordinary movements that, in retrospect, become loaded with meaning. Was she distracted? Was she hurrying? Did she already know something was coming? In the warmth of this imagined afternoon, you feel the subtle shift, the narrative current pulling you toward a darker stretch of the river. But for now, Bronwyn is still here in this moment, alive, vibrant, and unsuspecting. The sun glints on the water outside. Her children laugh somewhere down the hall. You hold on to that image, because soon the story will demand you let it go. You step across the threshold of the Winfield house as it stands now, years after Bronwyn's voice last echoed down the hallway. The air smells faintly of new paint and fresh carpet cleaner layers of renovation meant to erase time. But houses have a stubborn memory. Beneath the gloss, you sense an older rhythm, the way footsteps once fell on these floorboards, the hum of a refrigerator that's long since been replaced. The current owners didn't move in with ghost stories in mind. They came for the view over the Georges River, for the way the light floods the kitchen each morning. They might have been told, vaguely, that a previous resident moved away under difficult circumstances. In real estate, euphemism is an Olympic sport, mainstream historical fact. In New South Wales, laws around disclosing stigmatized properties, homes linked to crimes or disappearances, are notoriously gray. Unlike in some U.S. states, Australian, agents aren't always legally bound to spill the full backstory, unless directly asked. That means many buyers step over thresholds without any clue of the past drama baked into the bricks. Quirky tidbit: there's a small patch in the backyard where the grass grows just a shade darker than the rest. The owners joke that it's the compost patch, but the truth is less poetic. It's where the previous residents used to keep an old above-ground pool. Still, you can't help noticing how people love to weave their own small myths into places they don't fully understand. You move through the rooms. The living area, now painted a soft eggshell white. The hallway, where a few scuffs along the skirting board suggest children still race past in socked feet. But here's the thing: when you stop and stand very still, you can almost layer the present over the past. The faint echo of Bronwyn moving about her day. The murmur of her voice in the kitchen. The front door creak as someone comes home. Historians still argue whether spaces retain a kind of psychic residue, or whether it's simply our own minds projecting patterns onto silence. Is the atmosphere in this house different because of what happened here, or because you walked in knowing the story? You feel it all the same, a weight, gentle but undeniable. Neighbors say that after Bronwyn vanished, the house felt paused. Curtains remained drawn for days. Mail piled up in the box. The lawn grew shaggy in the summer heat. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to walk back through the door. When that didn't happen, life eventually seeped back in, but never quite in the same way. If you close your eyes, you can picture a mid-90s South scene here. Mismatched furniture, a bulky TV humming in the corner, a cordless phone charging on the kitchen counter. Someone's left a basket of laundry on the couch. There's a shopping list pinned to the fridge with a novelty magnet. And maybe, just maybe, Bronwyn's car is still in the driveway, keys resting in the dish by the door. Years later, the house would pass to new hands. Fresh coats of paint, new curtains, different laughter echoing down the hall. Children's drawings tacked to the fridge again, though belonging to another family entirely. The past didn't vanish, but it learned to live alongside the present. That's the thing about homes linked to unsolved mysteries. They're both utterly ordinary and quietly extraordinary. To anyone without the context, it's just a nice place with a garden and a good view. To those who know, it's a living archive, every corner holding the possibility of an unanswered question as you step back out into the Allawong Street. The late afternoon light feels sharper, almost too bright after the muted interiors. The house recedes behind you, blending into a neat row of suburban homes. On the surface, they're interchangeable driveways, mailboxes carefully trimmed, hedges. But one holds a story that still hums under the skin of the neighborhood, and you can't shake the thought. Somewhere out there, someone knows exactly how that story ends. You stand at the edge of the timeline, staring at the moment Bronwyn's presence becomes a blank space. The days leading up to her disappearance are a patchwork of ordinary domestic life and small, unsettling moments that only stand out in hindsight. It's early 1993 in Illawong. The cicadas drone in the trees, and the heat lays over the suburb like a heavy quilt. Bronwyn's neighbors see her coming and going, sometimes with her young daughter, sometimes alone, sometimes with an expression that could be read as tired or distracted, depending on who's telling the story. On the morning she was last seen, Bronwyn spoke briefly with a friend on the phone. No hint of anything unusual. She had errands planned, though exactly what they were varies depending on which family member you ask. And then, somewhere between those errands and the end of the day, she simply ceases to appear in anyone's confirmed memory. Mainstream historical fact. The early 90s in New South Wales saw a growing reliance on witness statements and manual record-keeping in investigations. CCTV was rare in suburban areas. Mobile phones were still luxury items, and electronic transaction data was patchy. A person could vanish with far fewer digital footprints than today. Quirky tidbit: one neighbor remembers that the Winfield's letterbox door squeaked so loudly you could hear it halfway down the street. They swore they heard it creak open that evening, long after Bronwyn was supposed to be home, though no one admits to checking what was inside. The official timeline leaves gaps you could drive a truck through. There are claims she was seen driving late in the day, though the make and model of the car vary depending on the witness. There are rumors she stopped for petrol at a service station miles from home, but no receipts survive to prove it. Someone insists they spotted her at a shopping center in Menai, though security footage from the time no longer exists. Historians still argue whether these conflicting sightings are examples of false memory, where people retrofit their recollections to match a story they've heard later. The human brain is notoriously bad at time-stopping events, especially when we want to believe we saw something important. The last confirmed sighting remains frustratingly mundane. Bronwyn, in casual clothes, heading towards her car in the driveway. Beyond that, the timeline fractures. Every hour that follows is filled with contradictory accounts and deafening silence. You try to imagine moving through those hours yourself. One moment you're on your street, the hum of the cicadas in your ears, your keys in your hand. The next, what? Did someone you know wave you over? Did you stop to help a stranger? Did you simply decide, in that split second, to change your day entirely? And then there's the question of who saw what in the aftermath. Friends and relatives offer versions that don't perfectly align. Some claim she was supposed to meet them and never arrived. Others say she phoned to cancel, though no phone record confirms it. The police reports, what's publicly available, anyway, read like an exercise in controlled frustration. The more you follow the cracks in the timeline, the more you realize they lead in every direction. Some are dead ends. Others feed into wild theories: accident, voluntary disappearance, foul play. Each possibility has its own set of proofs and passionate defenders. If you lay out the hours visually, you'd see two stark lines, one full of small, everyday events right up to that last confirmed sighting. The other, a sharp drop into white space. That empty stretch isn't just where Bronwyn disappeared. It's where the story itself begins to splinter. You can almost hear the clock ticking as you stand in that gap. You drift into the kitchen of someone who knew Bronwyn, though you're not sure which version of the truth they'd be willing to share. The air smells faintly of instant coffee, and the clink of a spoon against a mug feels louder than it should. You sit, and the conversation begins in careful, measured tones. Family dynamics are always tricky to untangle, but here they feel like a knot tied underwater. Every pull seems to make the whole thing tighter. Bronwyn's relatives speak of her in warm, almost protective terms, but there are pauses in their sentences, like spaces where something should be said but isn't. Friends talk about her with an openness that sometimes tips into guarded sympathy, as though the missing pieces of the story are still raw, mainstream historical fact. In 1993, police in New South Wales often relied heavily on interviews with close family in missing persons cases, believing the inner circle would hold the key. Statistically, many disappearances involved someone known to the victim. That fact shaped how the investigation unfolded and how the family experienced it. Quirky tidbit. One of Bronwyn's friends swears she used to make a secret pavlova by adding crushed candy canes to the meringue mix, producing a pink swirl that looked almost too cheerful to eat. The recipe's never been found in her belongings. You notice how certain names make shoulders stiffen. Some family members still don't speak to each other, even decades later. That's the kind of fracture that doesn't happen unless deep tensions existed long before the disappearance. When you ask, at least in your mind, what those tensions were, the answers come wrapped in vagueness. Oh, you know how it is in families. Which, of course, means you don't know at all. Historians still argue whether investigators' early focus on the family helped narrow the search or simply entrenched divisions that made gathering information harder. There's a point where suspicion stops being a tool and starts becoming a wall, and in Bronwyn's case, that wall seems to have gone up fast. Even friends tread lightly. They recall odd moments, unsettled phone calls, times when Bronwyn seemed worried about something, but they don't press. Or maybe they did, and she brushed them off. People often assume they'll have more time to ask the real questions. You can almost hear those unsaid words echoing in the silences now. There's also the matter of loyalty. In small communities, loyalty can be as fierce as it is selective. Someone may withhold details, not because they want to hide the truth, but because they're protecting their version of it. Truth in these situations becomes fractured, not exactly lies, but shards that cut differently, depending on which side you pick them up from. And then there's that unshakable human instinct to avoid becoming part of the story. If someone knows more than they've said, maybe they've convinced themselves it doesn't matter anymore. Maybe they've forgotten or buried it so deep they truly can't recall. You picture the investigators from back then, notebooks in hand, watching body language, scribbling half-legible impressions. Did they know, even then, that they were pulling on threads in a tapestry too tangled to unravel in one lifetime? Bronwyn's absence is still felt here, but it's as though the people closest to her have built their lives around it like a missing pillar. They step carefully, avoid letting the whole structure topple. And you, an outsider walking through their memories, can only wonder how many of those careful steps are meant to keep you from seeing what lies underneath. You find yourself on a stretch of road leading away from Illawong, the kind where streetlights thin out and the shadows start to feel taller. These are the roots woven into the theories about where Bronwyn might have gone that final day. You're not driving, just gliding, like in a dream, watching the edges of the road where fact and imagination keep swapping places. Theories sprout like weeds in the absence of hard evidence. Some grow straight and plausible. Others twist in wild directions until they're almost unrecognizable. The most straightforward theory: foul play by someone she knew. Statistically, it's the likeliest in cases where there's no sign of a struggle at home, but also no clear reason for voluntary disappearance. Another, more unsettling theory suggests she left on her own, intentionally stepping out of her life. That's the one people whisper about more than they openly discuss. If true, it would mean she'd chosen to leave her daughter, her home, her identity. It's not unheard of. History has several examples, like Agatha Christie's 11 Day disappearance in 1926, which still prompts debate about whether it was a breakdown, a publicity stunt, or something else entirely. Quirky tidbit: one Illawong resident recalls a mystery woman spotted weeks after Bronwyn vanished, shopping, barefoot at a small grocery in a neighboring suburb. She looked nothing like Bronwyn except, apparently, for her eyes. That's all it took for locals to begin weaving new branches of the story. Historians still argue whether such sightings keep investigations alive or just muddy the waters. A single false lead can pull resources in the wrong direction for weeks. Yet in cold cases, sometimes all you have are the maybes. And then there are the darker, more fringe suggestions that she stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see, or crossed paths with the wrong stranger at the wrong time. Some even imagine her becoming the victim of an opportunistic crime far from home. Her trail cold before the first missing persons report was even filed. You can feel how quickly people take ownership of a case like this. Each theory becomes a personal project for someone, a way of proving they've outsmarted the official narrative. In the pre-internet 90s, these debates happened over fences, in pubs, and in letters to local newspapers. Today, they'd be hashtags and comment threads. The scale changes, but the human impulse doesn't. What makes it more complicated is the lack of a clear endpoint. Without remains, without a confirmed sighting, every possibility remains technically open. Even the most implausible theory clings on. Like a stubborn knot dot, you drift further down that dark road, each street sign reminding you how many directions she could have taken, and how many of those turnoffs exist only in someone's memory. And for every person who swears they know which road is the right one, there's another standing at the same intersection, pointing the opposite way. Theories, after all, are just maps drawn in fog. You ease into the quieter corners of the present day, where Bronwyn's name surfaces only occasionally, often in the voices of people who weren't even born when she disappeared. The air feels different now, less charged, more resigned. It's the long, slow settling of a story that never quite ended. Her daughter is an adult now, navigating a life shaped by an absence she never chose. People often assume time heals, but here, time just changes the architecture of the grief. It turns jagged edges into smooth, worn stone, not gone, just less likely to cut you by accident. Still, every so often, a headline about a new forensic technique or a solved decades-old case must flicker across her mind like lightning behind closed eyelids. Mainstream historical fact. Cold cases in Australia have occasionally been solved after decades thanks to DNA breakthroughs, like the 2021 identification of a woman known only as the Lady in the Dunes in the U.S., which inspired similar forensic pushes globally. That knowledge keeps hope alive, however faintly. Quirky tidbit. In Illawong's small community Facebook group, a thread from last year asked for the oldest local mystery. Bronwyn's name came up third, after a missing cat and a phantom ice cream van that supposedly drove around at 2 a.m. in the 80s. The comments for hers were shorter, more careful. Historians still argue whether communities should keep cold cases alive in public conversation or let them fade to protect those left behind. Some believe constant reminders prevent closure. Others say silence is the real killer of truth. Today, the case exists in a strange limbo, neither solved nor forgotten. Police files sit somewhere in storage, marked with her name. A few detectives still remember the details. Others have retired, taking their own theories home with them. Every few years, a journalist might call the family, asking if they'd be willing to talk again. Sometimes they say yes. Sometimes they don't. You walk past her old street one last time in your mind. The houses are newer, gardens tidier, but somewhere under all that suburbia is the exact patch of ground where she laughed, planned, maybe argued, maybe dreamed. Whatever happened to Bronwyn Winfield didn't erase the space she took up it, just changed the shape of it in everyone's memory. And as you stand there in the quiet, You realize the story hasn't really stopped. It's just waiting for its next breath. You're back where it began on that late afternoon in September 1993, except now you're carrying everything you've learned along the way. You see Bronwyn in the driveway again, that easy smile, the casual wave. The world hasn't shifted yet, but you, the observer, know it's about to. This time you don't rush past the details. The faint smell of cut grass from a neighbor's yard, the way the sun hangs low and lazy over Illawong, the hum of cicadas beginning to swell. These are the last confirmed moments before she dissolves into the realm of mystery. The investigative files still leave more blanks than filled lines. In all the retellings, the known facts can be recited in under a minute. Bronwyn leaves home, says she'll be back. She isn't. No confirmed sightings, no conclusive evidence, no body. The absence becomes its own kind of evidence. Mainstream historical fact, Australia's Missing Persons Week, established in 1988, continues to highlight cases like hers, reminding the public that every year, thousands vanish without explanation. Quirky tidbit. A local postman once told a reporter he kept delivering junk mail to Bronwyn's house for years after, because no one told me not to. That quiet, unthinking routine feels like a metaphor for how the community carried on, still acknowledging her address even when she was no longer there. Historians still argue whether the human mind is better at solving mysteries or preserving them. In some ways, the endurance of Bronwyn's story proves it can do both. And maybe that's the strange comfort in all of this. While her physical trail has long gone cold, her story is still warm in the hands of those who pass it along. You've walked through it now, felt its weight and its unanswered questions. The truth could be something simple, mundane even, or it could be something that defies all neat conclusions. But for now, it rests in the same twilight where all unresolved stories live. And as with twilight, you can't quite tell whether you're closer to the end of the day or the beginning of the night. You take one last look at the street, the driveway, the figure who waves goodbye. Then you step back, letting her fade into the distance, carried away by the hum of cicadas and the slow turning of the years. Now the roads are empty again, and the noise of the day has faded to a low, steady hush. The mystery of Bronwyn Winfield lingers, but it's softer here, less like a wound and more like a photograph that's begun to fade at the edges. You can let the details drift. There's no urgency now, no need to replay the clues on a loop. Streetlights glow faintly, casting long shadows that sway gently in the night breeze. Somewhere, a window is cracked open, and the scent of jasmine rides it on the air. You picture her story resting quietly, folded away for the evening, safe for now. It's all right to leave the questions unanswered for a while. They'll still be here if you want to pick them up again tomorrow or in another lifetime. Mysteries have a way of waiting patiently. Your breath slows, matching the easy rhythm of the world outside. Each inhale brings in cool, calming air. Each exhale carries away a little more of the weight you've been holding. If your mind still lingers on her face, let it be the version in the sunlight, the smile, the wave, the promise of returning home. Keep that image if you wish, or let it dissolve into the soft blur of dreams. Soon, the hum of cicadas becomes the hum of your own quiet internal night. The questions fade, the streets empty, and the only journey left is the one into sleep. And so, with the story tucked away and the night holding you gently, you can let go, knowing the mystery will keep itself until morning.